Hey guys, no, you're not reading the title wrong or anything like that. What you're reading is indeed true. It is indeed true what you're reading because basically, this is the first time that I've celebrated a whole decade going into a new year and start. Basically, what I'm saying is this is the first time I've celebrated the end of one decade and the beginning of another for the first time since 1990 in one place. Since the start of 1990 slash the end of 1989, it's the first time in 30 years that this has happened. And I know that's hard to believe. That's hard to believe no matter how much you look at it, but it's true. I mean, I know I'm not the only one that's probably gone through this. And but for me it's a big deal in a sense because you know personally from a personal standpoint I should say the last time I celebrated a whole decade was here in California, and it was the end of the 1980s into the 1990s. But ever since then, um, it's been completely different. I mean, I'll explain it in a moment. I'm gonna do something here for a second. But it's completely. Um, like I said, it's just completely like it. To me, it's unbelievable to even look at or even to acknowledge. Um, Let me explain. You see, as I was mentioning, 1989, the end, going out of 1989, the 1980s, and into the 1990s, um, basically that was the last time that me and my family as a whole celebrated new celebrated. Well, it's not the last time we celebrated something as a whole, but what I'm saying is that it was the last time for me personally where I celebrated a whole decade in one place, in one state. Afterwards, it was more like, okay, you go in here, you go in there, you go in here, you go in there, you're moving all about. But for me, it's it's something more than that, and I'll explain it in a moment. But it's really something more because how do I put this? You know, usually, okay, I'll get into it in a moment, guys. I'm trying to think about what I'm going to say here. Um, but usually, okay, so but you now what I'm trying to say is usually when you celebrate a decade, even if you have to move, most times you're assured that you're going to celebrate it in one place, in one state, eight, if you will. Like for me, it's the state I was born in, California. And like I said, the last time I did that was it was when we were celebrating the end of the 1980s and going into the 1990s. Um, and that was the end of 1989 going into 1990. But that wasn't the case. And I remember specifically where me and my family were at that time. Me and my family were living right here in the Central Valley, but in Waterford, California. We were the first occupants in a new house, just like me and my mom are right now. With this house, where we've been for 3 years, we were the first occupants in that house. And we lived in that house even during the 1989 earthquake that took place during the World Series between the Giants and the A's. Yeah, the San Francisco earthquake, if you will. I can't even think of the name. The um, Las Positas or Las Almas, something like that. I can't even think about it. But we lived there when that happened. So that kind of tells you exactly how long it has been for me as a whole, as a person, when it comes to celebrating one decade in one place, one state. Because from a personal perspective, the from a personal perspective, I ended up celebrating all of the other decades after that. Um, I celebrated all the other decades after that, in between, going back and forth. What I'm saying is this, and let me get straight to it. When I was 10 years old, that was the last time I celebrated one whole decade in one place, in one state. Yes, me and my family moved various times, but we always remained in California. We never went to another state and celebrated a decade there. We always remained in one place. You know, we didn't move to Kansas in the middle of the 80s and then move back and be like, yeah, we could say we celebrated the 80s, the whole decade. We could let the whole decade of the 80s go out the bang, knowing we lived in California, then we lived in the Midwest, then we went back to California. We didn't do that. It was always California. That was it. No matter where we went from Fremont to Pittsburgh to Hayward to San Lorenzo to Waterford, you know, to Tracy, Livermore, Patterson, Newman, you name it, Modesto. It did not matter, where our family, either together or separate, moved to. Majority of the time, our family would remain, I should say, here in California. Now, for me, yes, throughout the 80s and even the early parts of the 90s, I went through that. But here's the thing. The 80s, like I said, the end of 89 into the beginning of 1990 would be the last time I'd ever do that. You see, I started off the decade, me and my family started off 1990, but little did we know, well, me and my sisters wouldn't know this until later on, but little did we know we would end up moving out of state to Kansas. Now, I don't want to get into much details, but let's just say there was something between my parents to where I think there was an agreement that when the time was right, the move would happen. I don't know. But anyway, long story short, 1992, spring of 92, we moved to Kansas. That move, however, for a majority of us only lasted 24 to 48 hours because we saw we were going to live in, because the house we saw we were going to live in, the house I ended up in anyway in 1994 with my dad, but basically the house we saw we were going to live in, my family was like, my mom and my family were like, nope, no thank you. Whoop! We went back. And by the grace of God, we came back here. Then 1993 came around. 1993 came around, I should say. Like I was saying, 1993 came around, and once again we moved out to Kansas because, long story short, my dad thought he had everything secure with a house in Topeka, Kansas, which was right across the street from Topeka High, his old alma mater. But then he found out he was ripped off. And my mom basically didn't have a good vibe about the house. Even though it had all the amenities we would need, she didn't have a good vibe. It was basically looked at as being part funeral home. I don't know. So, end result, we ended up living in the house that I ended up back in a year later or 6 months or so later, actually 8 months, 8 to 9 months later, I would end up living in the house where we ended up staying for 6 months in 1993 in Oskaloosa, Kansas. Yeah. Instead of having the house that my dad thought he had everything set up for us to be in Topeka, Kansas, we ended up having to stay in the Oskaloosa, Kansas one. The one that we basically took off from, in 1992 after only being there 24 to 48 hours. So, long story short, where do I come in? Well, 1994 came around. I was attending and graduating out of Bret Harte Junior High in Hayward, California. And I was sent back to live with my dad due to the fact that I had, certain issues, medical issues and all that I was still working on. Medical issues being like, personal ones. I don't want to get into them. Thank God I've gotten over that as I got older. I got better. Thank the Lord I got better as I got older. But anyway, it was due to some differences, clashes with my grandparents, who are now watching down on us from heaven. Basically, my grandparents just weren't too understanding like my parents were of my medical situation. So anyway, long story short, that, along with some kids at the Bret Harte Junior High threatening to beat the crap out of me, my mom decided, enough's enough. I'm going to send you back to Kansas to be with your father because you need a father figure in your life. And that's what happened. 1994, June of 1994, I flew out. My mom took me to, I think, the Oakland airport, and I flew off on the Southwest Airlines to Kansas City and moved back into the house with my dad, where my dad was staying at, back in with him from 1994 to 2000. Because in 2000, I ended up moving out on my own thanks to a miracle or info that I got when I went and represented what's known as Independence Inc. in Lawrence, Kansas, and as a representative, kind of told my story of how they helped me out. And in the process, I found out about an opening at what's known as Prairie Ridge Apartments in Lawrence, Kansas, and the rest was history. I ended up moving there in May of 2000, and then about a year later, I ended up getting my first official job, not work study job or vocational job or whatever you want to call it, with programs, during school or during the summer, after summer, summer programs, whatever. My first official job was at a BK, Burger King. And then the ball just rolled from there. I was at that job for about 3 years. Then, because of situations I don't want to talk about, I ended up being removed from there. I went and worked at the Hastings Entertainment Store. After a few months there, I was gone. Then, after a while, I got a job at the Home Depot. I got a job at the Food for Less. Yeah, there was a Food for Less right across the street from me. Got a job with them for a whole year until it went out of business. It was one of the Food for Less chosen to go out of business. Then I ended up working at the Home Depot, and then I was let go from that because they had overhired, according to what they said. And I'd already told them that I was going to leave for about a couple of days, or a couple of weeks, I should say, to be with my family for my birthday. So I don't know if that didn't help my cause or anything, but I was there at Home Depot as a maintenance guy, a custodian guy. And then after I came back, by the grace of God, I went online, applied for the Walmart in Lawrence, Kansas, the Supercenter. Well, while they were in the process of finishing its expansion into a supercenter, and I got the call almost the day after I applied, and I got hired as an unloader, or as we call them, a cap team member nowadays. And I worked there for a while, for about over a year, and I only worked there because I was planning to save up money to come back out here and move here and be with my family. And I would have remained with Walmart from 2006 to now, had the transfer gone the way I was hoping it would. You see, originally I was going to transfer to one of the Modesto Walmarts um, as part of moving out, but the Modesto Walmart wanted me in August of 2007. I couldn't do that financially, couldn't financially make that happen. So the best solution was the Livermore one, but that wasn't going to work because it's on one side of Livermore and my mom works on the other side. So long story short, because of that, I was let go from Walmart and I was unable to officially get a job again until about basically 5 years ago in 2014, February 18th, 2014, where with the Walmart that was about a year old afterwards in Patterson opened because the Patterson Walmart opened in 2013, January of that year. About a year later, I applied, got a phone call, and next thing I know, I was hired in as a cashier/cart associate, or stockman as they call it now. And I've been there now for about 5.5 years. Yeah, 5.5 years. Went from being cashier/cart pusher, at times mostly primarily cart pusher, stockman, associate, what do you want to call it, to finally becoming a cashier, getting that opportunity, and the rest is history. And now I'm one of those individuals that's looked at as sort of a utility kind of individual, utility like associate, to where if you need me somewhere, I will be there because I'm pretty much trained in having an idea of what to do in certain areas of the store now, to where the only thing I have to do next is try to take a test that will allow me to apply to be a CSM, customer service manager, or try to be a department manager in a department they might need me in, or something like that, or be a support manager, who knows. But yeah, the yeah, but yeah, if things would have worked out with the company, with the transfers would have gone right and correctly, then I would actually, instead of 5.5 years, believe it or not, I would be celebrating 13.5 years. Yeah. So if you combine the year that I had there, the year and a half I had there, with me still under the employment up until January of 2008, I was with Walmart from August 2006 to January 08. So about August, September, October, November, December, 5 months. I was with the company for about 17 months, for about a year and a half, up until January of 08, where they let me go because I didn't report to the one in Livermore. So if you combine that year and a half with this 5.5 years, I've been with the company for about 7 years whole, which means for 7 years I couldn't really get back there, or 6 years I couldn't really get back. I couldn't really, because I applied for the Modesto ones and everything, never heard anything. This one in Patterson comes along about a year after it opens. Here I am, wearing this now every day, or when I work, or when I'm scheduled to work. And despite our ups and downs at the job, hey, it's something. To me, it's something to make a living off of. And I look at it, I give it the mentality of being, you got to think about it like you're going back into high school. So that's how I look at it. Like, I look at it like this is just a resurrection or a rebirth of high school again, but I'm more of an adult, get paid by the hour kind of situation. But getting back on topic, throughout all that, I've never, up until now, never celebrated 1 decade in one place since the end of 1989 and the beginning of 1990. Not once. And it's been 30 years since that's happened. And here's the thing. I bring all this up because we began the first 4 years in California. I began the first 4 years of the 1990s in California. 4.5 years in California. I spent the next 6 years celebrating or living out in Kansas. So I spent a majority of the 90s in Kansas and only the first 4 years, 4.5 years in California. So I never, from 1990 to 2000, never celebrated a new decade or ending the 90s and going into the new millennium. Never once did I end. Never once did I end it in one place. Not once did I end one decade and century and going into a new century and decade and millennium. Not once did I do that in one state, in one area. I began the last decade of the 20th century in California, spent the first 4.5 years there, and then I ended the last 6 in Kansas. And the same could be said for the 2000s, the first decade of the 2000s. Never once did I celebrate the beginning of the 2010s and the ending of the 2000s in one place. I began the 2000s living in Oskaloosa and then spent 7 of those years on my own. And then afterwards came back here and spent the last 3 living in California and in Patterson, California. And guess what? Just like before, but in reverse, I spent the first 7 years or 7.5 years in the Midwest and the last 3.5 years here in California. And never once, just like with the 1990s, never once did I celebrate the beginning of the 2010s decade and the end of the 2000s decade in one place. It was in 2 separate places. Started off in Kansas, ended it in California. But now, it's totally different. Now is the first time in 30 years, I will be celebrating the end of one decade and the beginning of another in one state, in one place. I won't be split. I will not be beginning it in one state and then ending it in another. I can't say for the 2020s what that's going to bring, but you kind of get what I'm saying. And for me, it's a big deal. It may not seem like a big deal to a lot of people, but it is. I look at the fact that the last time I did this was 30 years ago. 30 years ago. That was the last time I celebrated the end of one decade and the beginning of another in one place, in one state. Sure, like I said, there was various moves from city to city, but we were always in one state/place, and not out of state or anything like that. It's going to be the first time for me in 30 years. 30 years. Since I was 10, that I'll be doing this. 30 years. And in these 10 years, never once have I had to worry about moving out of state. And again, it may not seem like a big deal to anybody, but it's a big deal to me. Because think about it. Put yourself in my shoes. You're beginning the decade in one state. You're ending one decade and beginning a new one in one state. But then all of a sudden, 5 years, 6 years later, or 9 years, about a decade later, you're ending it in another state or another place. You know, maybe I shouldn't really say that because there are those out there that know what I'm saying. They understand what I'm saying. But you see, there's a difference. And I don't mean to say this with any disrespect. I say this with all due respect. There's a difference. The difference is that I don't know, but I surely, in my opinion, doubt. In my opinion, I could be wrong, but I surely doubt that there are those watching that have had to wait 30 years that have basically been in my situation. I'm sure there are, and I could, like I said, I could be wrong about it. So I'm sure there are. That maybe not. I don't really know. But I'll put it this way. I'll correct myself here. There may not be many people there may not be a lot of people like myself that have had to wait that basically the last time, I should say, they celebrated the end of one decade and the beginning of another, that the last time they did that was 3 decades ago. 3 decades ago. That's the same with, that's where I'm coming from. So I know, in correction, I know there's probably some that know how I feel and have, are in that situation or in a similar situation, but there's not many. Not many. But there's a lot, but I will say this, in correction to what I said, there is plenty of us out there that have been through the situation. Maybe not like me, but I'm just pointing out from my personal experience why this feels special to me. Why this is a big moment, a big special occasion for me. It's because of the fact that, again, the last time I did this, I was only 10 years old. I was 10 and a half, actually. And that was the last time I celebrated the end of one decade and the beginning of another. And that was the end of 1989 and the beginning of 1990. That was the last time I celebrated the end of a decade and the beginning of a new decade in one place, in one state. All the other ones, I've had to look at it, I've had to divide that decade into 2 areas. Spending the first 4 years of the 1990s in California and ending the 1990s in Kansas. Starting the 2000s, the new century, the new millennium in Kansas for the first 7 years of that, 7.5 years, and then ending it back here home in California. And thus ending the 2000s decade here and beginning the 2010s decade here. And for the first time, I'm celebrating the end of a decade and the beginning of a new one without having to move out of state. I'm celebrating it back home where I belong. That's what I'm trying to get at. That for the first time in 30 years, I'm home celebrating the beginning of a new decade and the end of another one. That's what I'm getting at. And again, there are some out there that understand where I'm coming from, probably not many, but from my opinion, this is a big, big deal. And hopefully those out there are watching understand where I'm coming from. I hope they do. Excuse me. I hope they do. I hope they understand where I'm coming from. And I know it sounds like I'm rambling, I'm not making any sense, but what I'm getting at is this is a big deal for anybody that's been through this kind of a situation. It is a big, big deal. I mean, think about it. You're moving from place to place, state to state, and you're not having the chance to stay in one area, in one state, in one place for at least 1 decade to celebrate the ending of it and the beginning of a new one before you move again. Like I said, the last time I did this, I was only 10 and a half years old. Now I'm 40 and a half, and I'm ending a whole decade, and I look back and I realize that I am ending a whole decade for the first time in one state, in one place. And that's my home, California. I don't have to look back at this decade now, and look at it like, oh, well, I spent half of it in this state and half of it in the other, like I did with Kansas and California at the beginning of the 90s. Well, it was the first 4.5 years in California and then the rest in Kansas, and then the first 7.5 years of the 2000s in Kansas and the rest back here in California. This is the first time since the beginning of the 1990s, the end of the 1980s, that I'll be able to say I've lived a whole decade in one place, in one state. That I can celebrate the beginning, the end, and the beginning of one decade and the beginning of another in one place without having to say, without looking back and saying I have to divide it in certain parts of it, like first 4 years here, first 4 years there. You get the idea. But that's what it means to me. It means a lot to me. It means a lot, and and when I think about it, it's a big deal. It's bigger than I think anybody can imagine. And anybody that's in a similar situation that understands where I'm coming from knows that. So, and, so anyway, though, I just thought I'd talk about that. Just bring it up and kind of get it off my chest. Kind of let you know what to me and maybe others out there. Because I want to correct myself from earlier. Others out there have probably gone through and now are experiencing for the first time in who knows how long. For me, it's been 30 years. I don't know what it's been like for anybody else, but for me, it's the first time in 30 years that I can look back on one decade and say to myself, I've never had to move from one state to another. I've never had to begin a decade in one state and end it in another. I celebrate one decade. I'm actually ending one decade and celebrating a new decade in one place. And that's what really matters. It may not seem like a big deal to a lot of people, but it's a big deal to me. But anyway, I know I sound like I rambled a little bit, but let me know what you guys all think down below. Do you understand where I'm coming from? And have any of you gone through a similar situation? Or do you know of anybody that has? Let me know down below. Comment if you like. Thank you all for watching. And I will talk to y'all later. God bless. Take care. I'm out.